I knew something was off the moment I stood in front of the community mailbox and my access code didn't work. I punched it in again, same result. I wasn't even mad at first. I figured maybe it was a glitch. But when I walked back to my house, I spotted her, Tamara Zeller. 50-something, bleach blonde bob, oversized sunglasses even though it was cloudy, and the Queen No, the tyrant of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. She was standing in her driveway, arms crossed, watching me like some hawk guarding her nest. "Morning, Tamara," I said carefully. She didn't even blink. "Mailboxes were reprogrammed. You'll need to submit a formal request to the HOA to get your new code." I narrowed my eyes. Why would the HOA change mailbox codes without notice? Tamara's lips curled into what she probably thought was a polite smile. We had security concerns. Some residents weren't following proper mail etiquette. Junk mail overflow, loose packages. It reflects poorly on the neighborhood. I bit back the sarcasm bubbling up. That doesn't sound like a reason to lock people out of their mail. She tilted her head. Well, if everyone followed the guidelines, we wouldn't have to take these measures. I walked away before I said something that'd get me on her already ridiculous watch list, but inside I was boiling. I'm Jace Nolan. I'm a hospital night shift coordinator. I don't have time for HOA drama. But messing with my mail, that's crossing a line. I submitted the formal request that afternoon, like she said. Tamara didn't respond, not the next day either. I emailed again. Nothing. By the third day, I was missing a package with medical documents I was supposed to forward to my HR department. That's when I knew this wasn't just HOA overreach. This was personal, so I called the post office. They confirmed it. No, the USPs had not authorized any code changes. And yes, only postal workers or the box owner can authorize access changes. And finally, yes, tampering with mail access is a federal offense. I hung up and stared at my laptop screen, already pulling up the HOA charter I'd saved months ago when Tamara first tried to fine me for parking my truck too close to the curb. I wasn't just going to get my mail back. I was going to bury her in paperwork so deep, she'd need a backhoe to find her way out. HOA story HOA stories Homeowners Association stories. The next morning, I took a slightly longer route home from the hospital and stopped by the local precinct. I wasn't sure how seriously they'd take it, but I figured if I brought the right documentation, someone would listen. I handed over a printed copy of the email I got from the post office, a screenshot of the HOA's member portal showing no notifications about mailbox changes, and the HOA charter highlighting that only federal authorities or the assigned owner could alter mailbox access. Sergeant Darnell, a stone-faced guy with a faded Marine tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve, flipped through the pages with a raised brow. "You're telling me a civilian organization changed the code on a federally regulated mailbox without informing you?" I nodded. "They've refused to give me access to my own mail for 4 days now. I've got time-sensitive documents in there." He leaned back in his chair. "That's not just shady, that's obstruction of federal mail delivery. I'll escalate this." By the time I left the station, I already had a case number and a promise that a postal inspector would be looped in. That gave me the green light I needed. I wasn't just going to get even, I was going to make sure Tamara Zeller's little empire cracked wide open. I got home just after sunrise. I hadn't slept in over 24 hours, but adrenaline kept me upright. I set up a motion-activated camera angled at the mailbox cluster. If they had physically tampered with it, someone must have been caught on camera. I also dug up the bylaws from the developer's original layout filing, which specified that the mailboxes were federally assigned and off-limits to HOA control. It was public record, buried deep in the county clerk's database. By noon, I had a knock at the door. "Mr. Nolan," a man in a dark blue jacket held up a badge. "Inspector Ray's U.S. Postal Inspection Service. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" I invited him in and laid everything out: timeline, documents, and the hard drive from my camera. He took notes, asked for a copy of the HOA charter, and nodded slowly as he pieced the whole thing together. "Looks like your HOA president took it upon herself to assume federal authority. That's a serious offense." He tucked the evidence into a padded envelope. "If this pans out, she could face fines or worse." I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The gears were finally turning. That evening, I drove to the next town over and met with an attorney named Cassie Vega. I'd worked with her years ago when a hospital administrator tried to mess with my contract. She had a reputation for being relentless with paperwork and immune to intimidation. As soon as I explained what happened, she leaned back with a low whistle. "You're telling me she not only changed your access code but refused to reinstate it after you submitted the formal request she required?" "Exactly," I said. "I've got the email trail." She opened her laptop. "We start with a cease and desist. After that, I'll file for injunctive relief. If she's restricting access to federally protected property, we don't just have civil grounds, we have criminal leverage." By the following Monday, Tamara received the letter hand-delivered by a process server right in the middle of her morning walk with her lapdog, which I'd always suspected she only walked when trying to spy on neighbors. I watched from my porch as she yanked the envelope open and read the first few lines. Her eyes darted in every direction before she stormed back toward her house, yanking the dog along like it owed her money. That same afternoon, I got a call from a man named Dev Patel, a neighbor 2 blocks over who I barely knew. He'd heard what happened news was traveling fast and said his parents had experienced something similar. They were elderly and didn't know how to fight it, so they gave up. I asked if he had any proof, and he promised to send over his parents' HOA correspondence files. By the time I checked my inbox that night, I had scans of 3 separate notices. One claiming his parents had violated mailbox decorum by placing a holiday magnet on their box, another threatening fines for mail-related clutter, and a third stating their access code had been changed due to non-compliance. This wasn't an isolated incident. I forwarded everything to Cassie and Inspector Reyes. The response was almost immediate. Reyes flagged it for escalation, and Cassie added it to the civil claim. The more we dug, the clearer it became that Tamara had turned the HOA into her personal fiefdom, using federal property as a tool for control. 2 days later, a postal service vehicle pulled into the community. Reyes stepped out with another agent and began inspecting the mailbox cluster. A few residents wandered out to see what was going on, whispering behind hedges and porch columns. Tamara came marching down the sidewalk, demanding answers. "You can't just, this is private property," she snapped, hands gesturing wildly. Reyes didn't even look up. "Actually, ma'am, these mailboxes fall under federal jurisdiction. You've been reported for unauthorized tampering and obstruction. I suggest you step aside while we complete our inspection." She opened her mouth, closed it, and turned bright red. For the first time since I'd moved in, she didn't have a comeback. She just stood there as the agents opened the box panel and ran diagnostics on the code system. That evening, I received an email from Reyes confirming that the access codes had been manually altered without proper documentation. They were restoring the original assignments immediately and submitting their findings to the U.S. Attorney's Office for review. Meanwhile, Cassie filed a civil action against the HOA seeking damages for interference with mail access, emotional distress, and breach of organizational duty. Our case wasn't just about my mailbox anymore, it was about every resident Tamara had steamrolled. The final straw came at the emergency HOA meeting called by the board's treasurer, a nervous man named Louis who always looked like he'd rather be trimming hedges than handling finances. The clubhouse was packed, every seat taken, neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder. Tamara took the podium, flanked by 2 board members who looked ready to bolt. "I know there have been misunderstandings," she began, her tone measured but brittle. "But I assure you, every action I've taken has been in the best interest of Oak Ridge. You committed a federal crime," I said loudly from the 3rd row. You locked residents out of their own mailboxes and used it to punish people you don't like. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Dev stood up. My parents were threatened with fines for putting up a snowflake sticker. They couldn't even get their medication for a week. Ray's had given me permission to disclose the investigation's existence. Federal charges are pending, I added, and we've filed a civil claim against the HOA. Check your inboxes. Everyone on this block is listed as a potential co-plaintiff if you've been targeted. Tamara tried to speak again, but Louis stepped forward. Effective immediately, the board is voting to suspend President Zeller pending legal review. He turned to her with a stiff nod. You're relieved of duty. The room erupted. Some cheered, others whispered in disbelief. Tamara stood frozen, clutching the edge of the podium. For the first time, she looked small, like someone who'd finally realized she wasn't untouchable. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors approached me one by one. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others offered to share their stories. It turned out Tamara's reign had lasted longer than any of us realized, but it was over now. I didn't get much sleep that night. But not because I was angry or anxious. For the first time in weeks, I didn't have to worry about what might show up in my mailbox because I finally had the key. The morning after Tamara's public suspension, I stopped by the mailbox cluster on my way to the hospital. My original code worked again. The lock clicked open like nothing had ever happened. I pulled out a week's worth of mail, including the envelope I'd been waiting on postmarked 6 days ago. Word had spread. Not just about the federal investigation, but about the class action Cassie was organizing. People I'd never spoken to before were waving as I passed, dropping off handwritten testimonies in my mailbox and on my porch. One woman, Mrs. Hines, left a neat folder inside a grocery bag on my doorstep. She'd kept records of every HOA notice she'd ever received, over 80 pages worth. Most of it was absurd. Fines for excessive wind chimes, a warning about improper porch curtain color, and copies of multiple letters where she'd been accused of non-compliant mailbox decor for leaving a birthday card out for her granddaughter. Inside the folder was something else. A spreadsheet her son had made, tracking the dates and reasons for various mailbox code resets throughout the neighborhood over the past year. The pattern was obvious. Codes were being changed almost exclusively for residents who had filed complaints, refused to attend meetings, or disagreed with HOA proposals. I forwarded the file to Cassie, who called me that afternoon. This is exactly the kind of pattern courts look for, she said, tapping her pen against her desk. It shows intent, coordinated misuse of authority, and a direct link to retaliatory behavior. She paused. It gets worse. I pulled Tamara's financial disclosures from the HOA's annual reports. There are 2 disbursements labeled security maintenance that don't align with any known vendor. They match the dates of the mailbox code changes. I leaned back in my chair, processing. So she wasn't just changing access codes, she was funneling HOA funds to do it. Looks like it, Cassie said. And the numbers are large enough that we might be looking at misappropriation, possibly embezzlement. That same evening, a county sheriff's cruiser rolled through the neighborhood, not speeding, not with sirens, just slow and deliberate. It parked outside Tamara's house. I didn't see them knock, but about 20 minutes later, 2 deputies emerged with a small box and what looked like a wireless keypad system. They weren't the only ones watching. Residents stood in driveways, on porches, behind hedges. There was no confrontation, just a quiet, official extraction. The next day, I got a call from a name I didn't recognize. David Kim. He introduced himself as a former HOA board member who'd resigned 6 months earlier. I stepped down after Tamara started pushing for code enforcement technology upgrades, he said. None of her proposals were ever put to a vote. She said it was emergency protocol. Did you ever see the equipment? I asked. Not until the day I quit. She had a tech guy install a new control board in the clubhouse server closet. No contract, no receipts. Just a one-time payout from discretionary funds. I raised a concern and got a letter 2 days later saying I was being investigated for conduct unbecoming a board member. That's when I left. I asked if he'd be willing to talk to Rays. He didn't hesitate. I've been waiting for someone to do something about her for a year. By the end of the week, Rays confirmed multiple interviews had corroborated misuse of HOA funds. The inspection service had passed the case to the federal prosecutor's office for potential charges, and local law enforcement had opened a parallel investigation into financial misconduct. Then came the audit. Cassie filed a court motion to compel a forensic audit of the HOA's finances. The judge granted it without hesitation, citing community interest and probable cause. A firm was dispatched within 72 hours, and their team set up shop in the community clubhouse, sifting through records, receipts, and digital logs. That same afternoon, Louis the treasurer came knocking on my door. His hands trembled as he held a flash drive. I didn't know what she was doing with the money, he said. She told me it was for software upgrades. I never saw the invoices. I took the drive and handed it off to Cassie. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the people who'd been quietly punished for years, the elderly residents who couldn't fight back, the families who'd stopped decorating their porches every holiday just to avoid getting notices, the veterans on fixed incomes who Tamara had fined for unapproved flag placement. The audit team worked fast. Within 4 days, they'd uncovered a pattern. Over $20,000 in maintenance payments to a non-existent vendor, a series of cash withdrawals labeled as consulting, and a buried line item simply labeled Code Reset Tools. The judge overseeing the civil case issued a temporary freeze on all HOA accounts. Rays called to let me know that the U.S. Attorney's Office had officially filed charges: unauthorized tampering with federally protected mailboxes, obstruction of postal services, and mail theft conspiracy. The theft charge was added after they found a stash of undelivered packages in a locked closet in the clubhouse, most of them addressed to residents who'd had their codes changed. Medication, legal documents, even toys meant for kids' birthdays. The HOA board met again, this time behind closed doors with legal counsel. 2 more members resigned on the spot. Louis remained, but only to cooperate with investigators. By the following week, the county had assigned an independent trustee to manage the HOA's operations until a new election could be held. Tamara's house went dark. No porch lights, no movement behind the blinds. A notice appeared on her door 2 days later: federal warrant for seizure of electronic devices. Her car disappeared the next morning, but the real shift came at the next community gathering. It wasn't an official meeting. Just a Saturday afternoon barbecue in the park at the edge of the neighborhood. No clipboard check-ins, no rules about lawn chairs or dress codes. People brought casseroles, folding tables, drinks. Kids played in the grass. For the first time, the neighborhood felt like a community. I stood by the grill with Dev, who was helping flip burgers. He nodded toward the cluster of residents laughing near the picnic tables. "You think this sticks? The change," I glanced around, "depends on who we elect, but yeah. I think people are paying attention now." Cassie joined us a few minutes later, balancing a paper plate and a stack of signed affidavits. "Turnout's higher than I expected," she said. "People are ready to vote," I told her. They just needed someone to remind them they could. She smiled at that, not the smug kind, just a quiet, satisfied curve of the lips. "Federal court date set for next month," she said. "And the civil case is moving forward. With the audit findings, it's not just about access codes anymore. It's systemic fraud." I nodded. She underestimated everyone, thought we'd all just grumble and move on. Cassie's eyes swept the park. Well, she was wrong. And for once, standing in the middle of a neighborhood that had finally found its voice, I felt like we'd done more than take down a tyrant. We'd taken back our homes. 3 weeks after the barbecue, the neighborhood was unrecognizable in the best way. Front yards once stripped of character were blooming with flower beds and small porch flags. No one was worried about being fined for using the wrong mulch or placing a wind spinner in their garden. The community had begun to heal, but the legal gears were still grinding, and now they were about to hit full speed. Cassie called one morning while I was driving home from a double shift. Her voice was sharp and focused. "We got it. The judge signed the full discovery order. We now have access to every HOA board communication from the last 18 months' emails, texts, financial logs, and anything sent through their internal portal." I parked in front of my house before answering. "Any surprises yet? We're still combing through it." But there's one thread we flagged immediately. It's a string of emails between Tamara and someone named Arlen Voss. Ever heard of him? I hadn't. The name meant nothing to me. "He's not on the board," she said. "He's not even a resident." But Tamara paid him over $8,000 in so-called consulting fees. Turns out he's a former locksmith who lost his license for tampering with commercial mailboxes in another state. I sat in stunned silence. Cassie continued before I could process it all. "There's more." He sent her instructions on how to override the standard issue locking mechanism used in cluster boxes. She forwarded those instructions to the treasurer with a note that read, "Implement this before end of quarter, no paper trail." I finally found my voice. "Is that enough to upgrade the charges?" Cassie exhaled audibly. "It's enough to add conspiracy to tamper with federal infrastructure, and if the feds prove she paid Voss to assist with that." She's looking at time. By that afternoon, federal agents had executed a second warrant, this time for Voss's workshop on the edge of the county. They found modified lock cylinders, a binder of override codes, and a USB drive containing encrypted versions of all Oak Ridge mailbox assignments. Cassie called again that night. Voss flipped. He's cooperating, gave them a full list of every modification he made inside the community. And get this, he said, Tamara asked him to install a remote access feature on the lock system. She could change anyone's mailbox code from her phone. The pieces were lining up faster than anyone expected. During a closed-door pre-trial hearing, federal prosecutors presented the evidence. The payments, the instructions, the physical modifications, and Voss's testimony. Tamara's defense attorney tried to argue she believed the boxes were under HOA jurisdiction, but the presiding judge cut him off. "You expect this court to believe she paid an unlicensed locksmith, instructed her treasurer to hide the transaction, and reprogrammed postal infrastructure under the assumption it was part of her administrative duties." The judge recommended that the case proceed to a full trial with federal oversight. The same week, the civil suit Cassie had built was put before a state judge. We weren't just seeking damages anymore, we were demanding the HOA be placed under permanent independent oversight, with mandatory financial transparency requirements. The judge agreed to hear our motion in full within 30 days. Meanwhile, the community kept moving forward. A temporary board had been established and elections were scheduled. I hadn't planned on running, but after enough neighbors asked, I agreed to throw my name in. Not because I wanted power, because I wanted safeguards, and people trusted that I'd install them. One evening, I stopped by the community center to help with the setup for the election meeting. A woman I hadn't met before was arranging chairs. She introduced herself as Denise Holloway, a retired court reporter who'd moved in last year. "I used to sit in on trials all the time," she said, opening a box of ballots. "But I've never seen someone bury themselves as fast as Tamara did. You did this neighborhood a real service." "I didn't do it alone," I said. She smiled. "Doesn't matter, someone's always got to start the fire." On the night of the vote, the turnout was overwhelming. Over 2/3 of the neighborhood showed up, and nearly all of them cast a ballot. When the results were read, I'd been elected board president by a wide margin. I didn't celebrate. I just got to work. Our first motion was to abolish the discretionary fund that Tamara had used to funnel unauthorized payments. The second was to establish a rotating audit committee made up of 3 residents, selected at random every quarter, who would review all expenditures and meeting minutes. Every motion passed unanimously. 1 week later, the federal trial began. Tamara showed up in a tailored gray suit, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak a word during the proceedings. Her attorney tried to argue that she had only been trying to protect the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood, but the prosecution dismantled his position with cold, methodical precision. They presented Voss's testimony, which included detailed descriptions of how he'd installed the override system at Tamara's request, using diagrams she had printed for him. They showed the jury screenshots of her emails, one of which included the line, "We can't have these people doing whatever they want. They need to know we're watching." The most damning moment came when Reyes took the stand. He laid out the timeline of the investigation, the federal mailbox regulations, and the deliberate steps Tamara had taken to skirt them. When asked directly if her actions constituted a federal crime, he answered without hesitation, "Absolutely." And she knew it. The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours, guilty on all counts: obstruction of mail delivery, conspiracy to tamper with federal infrastructure, unlawful use of surveillance equipment, and misuse of HOA funds. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in federal prison and ordered full restitution to the HOA, along with a lifetime ban from serving on any residential board with fiduciary responsibility. The civil case closed shortly after. The court awarded damages to every resident who had been affected by the code changes or related fines paid out from Tamara's personal assets, which included a trust she had failed to disclose. The HOA was placed under a formal compliance monitor for 5 years. The day after the sentencing, the new board met for the first time on our own terms. No closed doors, no hidden agendas, no emergency protocols. Just neighbors, seated at folding tables, deciding how to make the place better. Dev volunteered to oversee community improvement grants. Denise offered to manage communications. Mrs. Hines, the woman who'd saved every letter, agreed to lead a welcome committee for new residents. When the meeting ended, no one rushed out. People lingered, talking about gardening projects and shared tool libraries. Someone played music from a portable speaker. Kids ran barefoot across the grass in front of the playground. I stood by the clubhouse doors, watching it all unfold. Cassie walked up beside me, arms crossed. "You know, most people would have settled for getting their mail back." "Yeah," I said. "But then Tamara wouldn't have learned anything." "She'll be learning for a while," she said. We didn't talk after that. We didn't need to. Everything that had needed saying had already been proven on paper in court and right here on this lawn. The neighborhood didn't just get its mailboxes back, it got its soul back.